before we get too far along. I'm kind of using a new setup here, and so I want to make sure everything's working right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our first Monday morning devotion. Hope everyone is doing well today. Make sure we're streaming. We're streaming. Good deal. Good deal. We'll give a few minutes for everybody to jump on and join us. My name's Ricky Johnson. For those of you who used to seeing Pastor at 8 o'clock on Monday morning, most of y'all know by now we're switching up the schedule a little bit, and you're going to be seeing me on Monday mornings. Pastor's going to be on Wednesday evenings at 6:45, and he's going to have a short word for you there before we get into our Wednesday night services, which will be in-person services now. So switching up the schedule a little bit, but hope you guys are able to join. If you're not able to join live, for those of you that are joining us later, thank you. Michael says it looks good. Thank you, sir. Michael's helping me get this set up. I'm using a little bit better setup, a little bit better camera, and going through some of our software programs. So hopefully this will look good. I can actually throw some cool little graphics up there. For those of you guys that have been watching and looking at and watching some of our live stuff, you know that we've switched things around, and Pastor came up with this name for this study, Deeper in the Word, and that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be doing an in-depth study of God's Word in different areas. And what I'm going to start out with is a study of a book by A.W. Tozer, and we're going to get into that in a moment. When everybody else jumps on here, it's just now 8 o'clock. So like I say, I just wanted to get on here a couple minutes early and make sure everything was working. Please like, comment, share. All those things are very, very important that we can get some exposure. The video last Thursday got several shares, and it had quite a bit of reach, and appreciate you guys doing that for me and getting it out there. It helps our channel, it helps our church, gives us more exposure. This is a great ministry tool that a lot of churches have engaged in more throughout the process of COVID-19 and whatnot, and our time of quarantine and all of that, giving us the ability to go online, which gives us, I think, a better opportunity to reach different audiences. So I think it's a good thing. So I appreciate you guys doing that. Please continue to do that. We're going to be doing a study on a book by A.W. Tozer called The Knowledge of the Holy. Is going to be kind of the basic outline that we're going to be using for this study. It's going to be a lengthy study. There's 22 chapters in this book, so obviously if we do a chapter a week or whatever, you're talking about quite a lengthy study. But A.W. Tozer, he lived in the early 20th century. He died in 1963. And I think that a lot of people see some of these older books and some of these older authors as kind of irrelevant, and so they leave them alone. And what I've found is you go on Kindle and find some of these books sometimes for $1. And I was telling my wife yesterday, I was like, it's walking down the street and seeing a pot of gold sitting on the side of the road, and you just pick it up. It's amazing to me that stuff is this available. But this book, it answers the question, who is God? And so that's kind of what we want to dive into. I think that we have the wrong idea of who God is. Good morning, Carolyn. And I want to ask you a question this morning. What comes to mind when you think about God? What comes to mind when you think about God? Who is He? What is His character? What are His attributes? When you think about God, do you have a specific one of His attributes in mind? And what is your idea about that attribute? A lot of people see God as mean. A lot of people see God as judgmental and just a tyrant ruling over the world. Some people think that he's just completely loving, and that he is and that's the embodiment of love, and that's not necessarily a wrong thing. But is that all you think about God? Is that all you know about God? So what comes to mind when you think about God? It could be that the answer to that question could be the very predictor of your spiritual future. How you answer this question could be the very predictor of how your spiritual future unfolds. And so that's kind of what we want to get into in the course of this study, is what do you think about God? And is it the right thing? Are you thinking rightly about God? And so today we're going to talk about why must we think rightly about God. That's the first chapter, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is kind of an introduction to this study. Why is it important to think rightly about God? What is his character? What are his attributes? And how can we really know the answers to these questions? A lot of people, I think, believe that God is somehow mysterious, that he is unknowable to a certain extent, and to a certain extent that is true, because he is infinite. There's a lot of things we can't know about God. There's a lot of things that we can't have insight into because God is infinite and we are not. But there are a lot of things that we can and should know about God. He gave us his word, but more importantly, he gave us access. He gave us access to his presence. And when you spend time with God, just like when you spend time with anybody else, you have the ability to learn about that person, to get to know that person. And God has given us the ability to get to know him in a way that many Christians today don't engage in. The last couple of times I've had opportunity to preach on Sunday morning, I have hit the idea of going into the Holy of Holies very hard, and going into that prayer closet and spending time in the presence of God. And that's the reason I'm stressing that so much, is because I don't believe that Christians today spend enough time in the presence of God. And that's the reason we have wrong ideas about God. And why is that important? We're going to talk about that. One of the things that the book hits on is that a church that fails to know, good morning, Hope, how are you this morning? A church that fails to know and understand God's character will begin to diminish its view of his majesty. And that's kind of what the basis of the book is. Even back then, this prophet of God recognized that the church had a diminished view of God's majesty, and that is huge. That's a huge, huge mistake for the church, to underestimate God's majesty and not have a correct view. And I think majesty is a good word. It's not that he's this great tyrant. It's that he's majestic, and the recognition of that is what should drive your worship. And I think so many in the church today don't have a good concept of what it means to worship God, because they have a wrong idea of who he is, and they have a diminished view of his majesty. A.W. Tozer said, with our loss of the sense of his majesty has come the further loss of religious awe and consciousness of the divine presence. We have lost our spirit of worship and our ability to withdraw inwardly to meet God in adoring silence. Our ability to enter into his presence and worship him is greatly affected by how we view him. And if we have a diminished view of his majesty, and we don't put him in his proper place, or we don't understand him in the right way, it's going to affect how we worship. Do you have trouble entering into a time of worship with God? It might be that you have a wrong idea of who he is. It might be that you have misconstrued certain parts of his character, and it affects how you interact with him. Have you ever met someone and got the wrong impression about that person, and because of that you had difficulty interacting with them, but then you found out who they really are, and suddenly you found a friend, you found someone that you could spend time with, you could engage with? I think a lot of people have that about God. They have a wrong idea of who he is and how he is, and as a result, it affects that intimacy. If you want to have a correct approach to worship and a correct approach to who God is, you need to understand, or a correct approach to worshiping Him, you need to understand who He is. Looks like we got Greg. Good morning, Greg. Hope you're doing well this morning. We're going through this book right here. I'll leave that up there for a moment. It's like $10 on Amazon. If you get it through Kindle, it's like $1. I mean, it's like 99 cents. And it's like a pot of gold. Seriously. Knowledge of the Holy by A.W. Tozer is the book we're starting on today. What comes into our mind when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Tozer said, the history of mankind will probably show that no people has ever risen above its religion, and man's spiritual history will positively demonstrate that no religion has ever been greater than its idea of God. No religion has ever been greater than its idea of God. Worship is pure or base as the worshiper entertains high or low thoughts of God. The depth of your relationship with God is completely dependent upon your high or your low opinion of Him. In fact, if you really get down to it, our thoughts about God will have a greater bearing on how God judges us than even our words or our actions. How you view God will matter more when you are standing before His throne than your words or your actions. Why is that true? Well, because your words and your actions are completely driven by your opinion of Him. And if you have a high opinion of Him, it's going to affect how you live. If you have a low opinion of Him, it's going to affect how you live. And so your mindset and how you view God is of utmost importance. I'll get this out of the way for now. Men move toward their mental image of God. So what do you believe about God? What attributes do you give Him? What characteristics do you recognize about Him? And are those things correct? These are questions we have to ask. And the truth is, only after an ordeal of painful self-probing are we likely to discover what we actually believe about God. Well, why is that true? Well, because oftentimes the things that we create in our mind about God are just that. They're our creation. And it takes a level of humility to get to the point where you can recognize what you have created in your own mind and what God's Word actually says, or who God really is. And it takes a time in His presence, which is not a comfortable place to be. I think that oftentimes we get this idea through, especially modern worship, that being in the presence of God is always a peaceful and experience, and it oftentimes is, but sometimes it's an uncomfortable experience, because what happens in the presence of God is there's a refining fire that takes place, and it burns and it cuts things out of your life, and it's supposed to do that. And one of the most important things that can cut out of your life is wrong ideas about who God is. And so it can be a painful process to dive in and find out exactly what it is that we believe about God. When we create our own version of God, we tend to fashion them after our own image. Tozer said it will be base or pure, cruel or kind, according to the moral state of the mind from which it emerges. Have you ever noticed that mean people tend to portray God as mean, and overly nice people tend to have this image of God that is just completely over the top, bubbly, loving? It's because we tend to want to make God more like our personality. I don't know why that is, but it's true, and I think we know that that's true. And the problem with that is when you're basing your view of God over how you would like Him to be, then God is not you're not being made in His image, He's being made in yours, and that is the essence of idolatry. And that's when you can't. One thing that I've noticed is that people that have strong opinions about God are oftentimes the people who don't pray and don't spend time in his presence. People that you know don't go to church. They don't spend time in his presence, and yet they want to tell everybody else what God is and how he is. If you don't know him if you don't spend time with him. And if you don't know him because you haven't spent time with him and you're trying to describe him, you're not describing him. You're describing what you want him to be. And that is the essence of idolatry. And it's not a good thing. One reason that God hates idolatry so much is because it's a libelous attack on his very character. God hates it when we create his attributes in our image and try to make him into what we want him to be. Tozer said the essence of idolatry is the entertainment of thoughts about God that are unworthy of him. It begins in the mind and may be present where no overt act of worship has taken place. He's saying that even before they built the calf at Mount Sinai, even before you make yourself a graven image, and many of us don't go that far technically as to fashion an image, although I do believe we have a lot of idols in our life. Before you get to that point, you have to first have a bad understanding of who he is in your mind. It always starts in your mind. And you're doing a character assassination of God when you do that. It's very important that we have right thoughts about God, because it can take us to a very dangerous place of idolatry. Romans chapter 1, verses 21 through 23 says this: "For they knew God, but they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things." Before they got to the point where they were engaging in physical idolatry, it started by having wrong ideas about God in their mind. They knew him, but they didn't worship him as God. They created in their mind this image of God, and that eventually led to them to finding. Sorry, my dogs are taking off here. Anyways, wrong ideas about God are not only the fountain from which the polluted waters of idolatry flow, they are themselves idolatrous. The idolater simply imagines things about God and acts as if they were true. Calm down, dude. That's Jack, by the way. Some of you guys met my dog last week, but I didn't tell you who he was. His name is Jack. So wrong ideas about God are not only the fountain from which the polluted waters of idolatry flow, they are themselves idolatrous. The idolater simply imagines things about God and acts as if they were true. This was the constant downfall of Israel. You look at Israel, and they go to a time of faithfulness, and then they go through a time of downfall, and they go to a place of idolatry, and all of this takes place throughout their history. And I think that we're going through a lot of that here in America as well. The first step down for any church is taken when it surrenders its high opinion of God. I think that we have a very limited view of God. I think that there are those who look at God in his judgmental form, and they see God as a rule bearer and a strict disciplinarian. And then on the other side of the coin, I think that there's people that believe, well, God just loves everybody, and he's just going to allow us to live how we live because he's a God of love. These are two very bad ideas, because neither one take into account all of who God is. Is God holy? Yes. Is God just? Absolutely. Is God loving? Yes, he is. Does God have grace? Does he have mercy? Yes. All of those things are true, but all of them are true about God. And if you only focus in on the attributes of God that you like or that you identify with, you're not worshiping God. You're worshiping a God that you have created. And so over the course of this study, what we're going to do is we're going to answer the question, what comes to mind when you think about God? And we're going to try to make that question, the answer to that question, the correct one. We're going to take each of God's major attributes, and we're going to break them down, and we're going to discuss them, and we're going to ask the question, who is God really? And I think by the end of it, you're going to have a deeper understanding of who God is. You're going to have a deeper time of worship in His presence, and you're going to spend and you're going to be able to know Him in a way that you should be known, or a way that He should be known. What it says in the Bible is that there are some that got to heaven and said, "Didn't I do this? Didn't I prophesy in your name? Didn't I cast out demons?" He's going to say what? He's going to say, "I never knew you." I think it's because a lot of times we engage in ministry even, and we use the gifts that God has given us, but we don't engage in a relationship with Him because we have entertained ideas that are less than Him. And it's very important that we keep that in perspective. So hopefully through the course of this study, we will answer that question correctly, and we'll get in a right place with who He is. I hope you guys enjoyed this new setup, and may try to improve on this along the way. And if you want a copy of this book and you can't afford $10, hey, just let me know. I'm probably going to buy a few of these and take them up to the church anyway, so they'll be available. Please comment, like, share this video. This is our opener for what we're doing on this study, and so I want people to see it, to see if it's something that they're interested in. So please get it out there and let people see it. And I will see you guys next week, Monday at 8 o'clock, and we're going to get into the first attribute. So thank you guys. God bless.